Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, where we explore the mundane details of the past to help you drift off peacefully. Tonight, we're diving into the surprisingly dismal world of French revolutionary cuisine, or rather, the complete lack thereof. Picture this. It's 1789, and you're a Parisian baker trying to make bread with flour, so poor it's practically sawdust. The wheat harvest has failed again. Sugar is more precious than gold, and your customers are growing increasingly angry about the rising price of their daily baguette. This isn't just inconvenience. This is the slow-burning fuse that would ignite one of history's most dramatic revolutions. While most people focus on the guillotine and political upheaval, tonight we're taking a different approach. We'll explore the tedious details of empty granaries, the bureaucratic nightmare of price controls, and the mind-numbing complexity of bread regulations that somehow managed to make eating one of life's most basic pleasures into a source of national crisis. From the dreary mathematics of grain distribution to the monotonous reality of rationing systems, we'll examine how something as simple as getting enough food became impossibly complicated. We'll discuss the boring, administrative details of how the government tried and failed to manage food supplies, the repetitive daily struggles of ordinary citizens searching for their next meal, and the surprisingly dull economic factors that made even the most basic ingredients scarce. So settle in comfortably as we embark on this thoroughly unstimulating journey through the culinary wasteland of revolutionary France. Let the gentle monotony of historical food shortages and bureaucratic incompetence guide you toward peaceful sleep, while we explore why something as fundamental as eating became so remarkably, catastrophically difficult during one of history's most turbulent periods. Our story begins in the countryside, where the very foundations of French food production were already crumbling long before anyone thought to storm the Bastille. To understand why food became such a catastrophe during the French Revolution, we need to step back and examine what French society was eating before everything fell apart. Picture France in the 1780s, a country where your social class determined not just where you lived or what you wore, but fundamentally what you could put in your mouth each day. The French food system before the Revolution was built on a rigid hierarchy that would make modern inequality look almost quaint. At the very top sat the aristocracy, dining on elaborate multi-course meals that could feed entire villages. These weren't just meals. They were theatrical performances of wealth and power, with dishes arriving in precise choreographed sequences. A typical aristocratic dinner might begin with soup courses, followed by fish prepared in delicate sauces, then multiple meat courses, including roasted fowl, game, and beef. The wealthy consumed sugar liberally, a luxury so expensive that it was literally worth its weight in silver. They drank fine wines from their own vineyards, imported spirits, and had access to exotic exotic spices that traveled thousands of miles to reach their tables. But here's where it gets interesting from a historical perspective. The aristocracy didn't just eat well, they ate ostentatiously. Banquets were designed to demonstrate superiority through excess. A single meal might feature dozens of dishes, most of which would barely be touched. The waste was intentional, a deliberate display that they could afford to throw away more food than most people would see in months. The middle class, or bourgeoisie, occupied an interesting middle ground in this food hierarchy. Wealthy merchants and professionals could afford meat regularly, though not the exotic preparations of the nobility. They ate beef, pork, and chicken, supplemented with vegetables from market gardens. Their meals were substantial, but practical, focused on nutrition rather than spectacle. These middle-class families might enjoy white bread, a significant luxury that distinguished them from the masses. They could afford butter, eggs, and cheese with regularity. Their kitchens were equipped with proper cooking implements, and they employed servants who knew how to prepare more complex dishes. Wine was common at their tables, though not the finest vintages reserved for the aristocracy. But the vast majority of French people, roughly 80% of the population, lived in a completely different food reality. These were the peasants, urban workers, and rural laborers who formed the backbone of French society. Their diet was monotonous, precarious, and barely adequate for survival. The foundation of the common person's diet was bread, but not the refined white bread of the wealthy. Instead, they ate dark, coarse bread made from whatever grains were available and affordable. This bread was often mixed with barley, rye, or even ground chestnuts and acorns when wheat was scarce. The texture was dense and heavy, and the taste was sour and gritty. A typical peasant family would consume between 2 and 4 pounds of this bread per day. It wasn't just a side dish, it was the meal. Bread provided roughly 75% of their daily calories. When bread was available and affordable, life was manageable. When it wasn't, people starved. Beyond bread, the common diet included whatever vegetables could be grown in small plots or gathered from the wild. Cabbage, onions, and leeks were staples, often made into thin soups or gruels. Meat was an extraordinary luxury, perhaps enjoyed a few times per year during festivals or special occasions. When meat did appear, it was usually in the form of small amounts of pork or poultry, stretched into stews with vegetables and grains. The cooking methods available to common people were limited and primitive. Most families cooked over open fires in single-room dwellings. They owned perhaps 1 or 2 pots, and cooking techniques were basic. Boiling and stewing were the primary methods, as these could make tough, cheap ingredients more palatable and extract maximum nutrition from minimal resources. Preservation was a constant concern for common families. Without refrigeration, food spoilage was a daily battle. Salt was expensive, so most preservation relied on smoking, drying, or fermentation. Vegetables were pickled when possible, and any surplus from harvest time had to be carefully preserved to last through winter months. The seasonal nature of food availability created a rhythm of feast and famine that defined peasant life. Spring was often called the hungry season, when the previous year's stores were depleted, but new crops hadn't yet matured. Families would forage for wild greens, tree bark, and anything edible they could find. Summer brought relief with fresh vegetables and fruits, while autumn was the crucial time for preserving food for winter survival. Regional differences added another layer of complexity to French food culture. Northern France relied heavily on wheat and dairy products, while southern regions incorporated more olive oil, wine, and Mediterranean influences. Coastal areas had access to fish and seafood, while inland regions depended more on grains and livestock. The urban poor faced unique challenges in this food system. Unlike rural peasants, who could at least grow some of their own food, city dwellers were entirely dependent on markets and food vendors. They lived in cramped quarters with minimal cooking facilities, often sharing communal ovens or eating from street vendors who sold prepared foods. Urban workers might start their day with a piece of bread and perhaps some weak beer or wine mixed with water. Their main meal would be more bread, possibly with a small amount of cheese or vegetables. Meat was so rare in urban working-class diets that its appearance was noteworthy enough to be mentioned in personal letters and diaries. The contrast between social classes wasn't just about quantity, but about the entire relationship with food. The wealthy planned elaborate menus, employed skilled cooks, and treated dining as entertainment. The poor planned around survival, stretching every ingredient as far as possible, and treated eating as a basic necessity that was never guaranteed. This system had existed for centuries, maintained by tradition, law, and economic necessity. The aristocracy controlled the land, the mills, and the markets. They set prices, controlled distribution, and extracted taxes and rents that kept the common people perpetually on the edge of subsistence. It was a delicate balance that required good harvests, stable weather, and social acceptance of inequality. What made this system particularly fragile was its dependence on bread as the foundation of survival for the masses. Unlike more diverse food systems, French society had evolved around grain cultivation and bread production. When this system failed, there were few alternatives. The poor couldn't simply switch to other foods because other foods were either unavailable or unaffordable. By the 1780s, this ancient food hierarchy was about to face unprecedented challenges that would expose its fundamental weaknesses and contribute to the collapse of the entire social order. The year 1788 brought with it a catastrophe that would shake the very foundations of French society. The bread crisis wasn't merely an inconvenience. It was a death sentence for thousands, and the spark that would ignite revolutionary fervor across the nation. To understand just how devastating this crisis became, we need to examine the perfect storm of circumstances that converged to create what historians now call the Great Famine of 1788. The trouble began with the weather. The summer of 1788 was unlike anything the French had experienced in living memory. Violent hailstorms swept across the countryside in July, destroying entire wheat fields in a matter of minutes. These weren't ordinary storms. Witnesses described hailstones the size of chicken eggs pummeling the grain, until nothing remained but broken stalks and muddy pulp. The storms were so severe that they shattered windows in farmhouses and killed livestock caught in the open fields. Following the hailstorms came an unprecedented drought. The sun beat down mercilessly on the already damaged crops, withering what little grain had survived the initial assault. Rivers that had flowed for centuries began to dry up, leaving behind cracked earth and the skeletal remains of water mills that could no longer function. Without water to power the mills, even the grain that did survive couldn't be processed into flour. Then, as if nature hadn't inflicted enough punishment, the winter of 1788 to 1789 became one of the coldest on record. The Seine River froze solid, something that happened perhaps once in a generation. People could walk across the ice from one bank to the other, but this novelty came at a terrible cost. The frozen waterways meant that grain shipments from other regions couldn't reach the cities. Barges loaded with wheat sat trapped in ice, their precious cargo tantalizingly close, yet completely inaccessible. The impact on bread production was immediate and catastrophic. In normal times, a 4-pound loaf of bread, the daily requirement for a working man, cost about 8 sous. By the spring of 1789, that same loaf cost 14 sous when it could be found at all. For context, a typical laborer earned only 20 sous per day, meaning that bread alone now consumed 70% of his entire income. This left almost nothing for other necessities like clothing, fuel, or housing. But the crisis went far deeper than simple price increases. The very availability of bread became uncertain. Bakeries that had operated for generations suddenly found themselves with empty shelves. The familiar sight of fresh loaves cooling on wooden racks became a memory as bakers struggled to obtain even the most basic ingredients. When bread was available, it was often of such poor quality that it barely deserved the name. Desperate bakers began mixing sawdust, ground acorns, and even clay into their dough to stretch the limited flour supplies. The resulting bread was dark, gritty, and difficult to digest. Many people who ate this adulterated bread suffered from severe stomach ailments, adding illness to their already overwhelming burden of hunger. Children were particularly vulnerable. Their small bodies unable to process the foreign substances that had been mixed into their daily sustenance. the government's response to the crisis was woefully inadequate. Finance Minister Jacques Necker attempted to import grain from other countries, but these efforts were hampered by France's ongoing financial difficulties. The state treasury was nearly empty, making it impossible to purchase sufficient quantities of foreign wheat. Even when grain was successfully imported, the distribution system was so inefficient that much of it spoiled before reaching the people who needed it most. Local authorities tried to implement rationing systems, but these measures often created more problems than they solved. Bread lines stretched for blocks, with people waiting for hours in the cold for a chance to purchase their meager allocation. Fights broke out regularly as desperate citizens competed for the limited supplies. Women, who traditionally handled household food procurement, found themselves at the center of increasingly violent confrontations over access to bread. The psychological impact of the bread crisis cannot be overstated. Bread wasn't just food in 18th century France. It was a symbol of social stability and governmental competence. When the government could no longer ensure that its people had access to their daily bread, it lost a fundamental aspect of its legitimacy. The phrase, "let them eat cake," whether Marie Antoinette actually said it or not, became a powerful symbol of aristocratic indifference to popular suffering. Rural areas suffered differently, but no less severely than the cities. Peasant families who had traditionally grown their own grain found themselves competing with urban buyers for the limited supplies available in local markets. Many were forced to sell their seed grain, the wheat they had set aside for next year's planting, just to survive the immediate crisis. This short-sighted necessity meant that even if the weather improved, the following year's harvest would be severely compromised. The bread crisis also exposed the deep inequalities that characterized French society. While common people fought over scraps of adulterated bread, the wealthy continued to enjoy elaborate meals featuring multiple courses and expensive ingredients. The contrast was stark and infuriating. Aristocrats who had never experienced real hunger continued their lavish lifestyle, while their tenants and servants literally starved at their gates. Market towns, which had traditionally served as distribution centers for agricultural products, became scenes of desperation and violence. Grain merchants found themselves caught between angry crowds demanding affordable bread and their own need to make a profit. Many merchants were accused of hoarding grain to drive up prices, leading to attacks on warehouses and granaries. The traditional market system, which had functioned for centuries, began to break down under the pressure of scarcity and social unrest. Women played a particularly crucial role in the bread riots that began to erupt across France. As the traditional managers of household food supplies, they felt the crisis most acutely and were often the first to take action. Groups of women would march to bakeries, demanding bread at pre-crisis prices. When their demands were refused, these peaceful protests often escalated into violent confrontations with local authorities. The bread crisis of 1788 and 1789 was more than just a food shortage. It was a complete breakdown of the social contract between rulers and ruled. For centuries, the French monarchy had maintained its legitimacy partly through its ability to ensure basic subsistence for its subjects. When this fundamental responsibility could no longer be met, the stage was set for the revolutionary upheaval that would soon follow. The year 1788 brought what historians would later call the Great Fear, not just of political upheaval, but of genuine starvation. The bread crisis had evolved from inconvenience to catastrophe, and the French people were beginning to understand that their government had no real solutions to offer. Picture this scene from a Parisian bakery in early 1789. Dawn breaks over the cobblestones, and already a line of perhaps 200 people stretches around the block. These aren't just the poor. You'll find merchants, clerks, even minor nobles standing shoulder to shoulder, all united by the same desperate need for bread. The baker, Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, opens his shutters at 6 in the morning. He's been awake since 3, kneading what little flour he could obtain into loaves that will feed perhaps 50 families. The math is simple and terrifying. He has bread for 1 in 4 people waiting outside his door. As the morning progresses, the mood in the line shifts from hopeful patience to anxious murmuring, then to something darker. A woman near the front, Marie Dubois, clutches her empty basket with white knuckles. She's been in line since 4 in the morning, leaving her 3 children at home with nothing but water and the promise of bread. Behind her stands Pierre Moreau, a carpenter whose work has dried up as construction projects halt due to economic uncertainty. His wife is pregnant with their 4th child, and they haven't had a proper meal in 3 days. The irony isn't lost on him. He builds homes for the wealthy while his own family starves. By 8 o'clock, Baker Rousseau emerges with the devastating news that many have already suspected. "I have bread for perhaps 40 families," he announces, his voice barely audible over the crowd's reaction. The price is 8 sous per loaf. 8 sous, nearly a day's wages for a laborer. The crowd's response is immediate and visceral. Shouts of anger mix with cries of desperation. Someone throws a stone at the bakery window. Others begin pushing forward, abandoning the orderly queue that had held for hours. This is how civilized society begins to fracture, not with grand proclamations, but with empty stomachs and broken promises. Marie Dubois, still clutching her basket, makes a calculation that thousands of French mothers were making daily. She has 6 sous in her pocket, enough for 3/4 of a loaf. She can feed her children today, but tomorrow there will be nothing left. The choice between immediate starvation and slightly delayed starvation is no choice at all. The government's response to these daily scenes of desperation was both inadequate and tone-deaf. Finance Minister Jacques Necker proposed importing grain from abroad, but the treasury was so depleted that even this basic measure proved nearly impossible to fund. The irony was stark. France, historically one of Europe's great agricultural powers, was begging other nations for food. Meanwhile, in the Palace of Versailles, the disconnect between rulers and subjects reached almost surreal proportions. Court records from this period show that the royal kitchens were still preparing elaborate multi-course meals, while Parisians fought over crusts of bread. One particularly jarring entry describes a dinner featuring 37 different dishes, served on the same day that riots broke out at 3 different bakeries in the capital. The psychological impact of the bread crisis extended far beyond physical hunger. French society had operated for centuries on the understanding that the king was responsible for ensuring his people could eat. This wasn't just political theory. It was a fundamental part of the social contract that bound the monarchy to its subjects. When bread became unavailable, it wasn't just a policy failure. It was a betrayal of the most basic obligation of kingship. The phrase, "let them eat cake," whether or not Marie Antoinette actually said it, captured perfectly the growing perception that the royal family simply didn't understand or care about their subjects' suffering. The crisis also revealed the shocking inefficiency of France's food distribution system. Grain might be rotting in warehouses in one province, while people starved just 50 miles away in another. The complex web of local taxes, guild restrictions, and transport regulations meant that moving food from surplus areas to deficit areas was often impossible, even when both the grain and the money existed. Consider the case of the Beauce region, just southwest of Paris. This area was one of France's most productive grain-growing regions, capable of feeding hundreds of thousands of people. Yet, in the winter of 1788, much of this grain sat in storage while Parisians went hungry, because the guild system prevented outside bakers from purchasing it, and local transport networks had broken down. The human cost of these systemic failures was measured not just in hunger, but in the complete breakdown of social norms. Theft became commonplace, not just of bread, but of anything that could be traded for food. Church records from this period show a dramatic spike in confessions related to stealing. As desperate people sought absolution for crimes, they felt they had no choice but to commit. Women, traditionally the managers of household food supplies, found themselves at the center of the crisis. They were the ones who stood in the bread lines, who negotiated with bakers, who decided which family members would eat and which would go hungry. This experience would prove politically crucial. When the revolution began in earnest, women's participation wasn't theoretical, but born from months of daily struggle for survival. The bread crisis also accelerated the collapse of traditional authority structures. When local officials couldn't provide food, people stopped respecting local law. When the church couldn't feed the hungry despite its vast wealth, religious authority began to crumble. When the nobility continued to feast while commoners starved, the entire concept of aristocratic privilege came under attack. By early 1789, the situation had become so desperate that even the government's own officials were beginning to panic. Police reports from Paris describe a city on the edge of complete breakdown, where any rumor about bread availability could trigger riots, and where the mere sight of a well-fed person could provoke violence. The final psychological blow came when people realized that this wasn't a temporary crisis that would resolve itself with the next harvest. The underlying problems, the debt, the inefficient distribution system, the political paralysis, meant that even if the immediate food shortage ended, the vulnerability would remain. This wasn't just hunger. It was the recognition that the entire system was fundamentally broken. As we moved deeper into 1789, the bread crisis would transform from a problem of food distribution into the spark that ignited revolutionary change. The same people who had stood patiently in bread lines would soon be storming the Bastille, and the same desperation that had driven them to fight over loaves would drive them to fight for an entirely new form of government. While bread may have been the foundation of French sustenance, meat represented something far more precious during the revolutionary years. The collapse of traditional livestock systems created a protein crisis that would define the eating habits of an entire generation. Before the revolution, meat consumption followed strict social hierarchies. The wealthy enjoyed beef, lamb, and game from their estates, while common folk might taste meat only on special occasions. A typical peasant family consumed perhaps 20 pounds of meat per person annually, compared to over 100 pounds for the aristocracy. The revolutionary upheaval shattered these established patterns entirely. Noble estates, once home to vast herds of cattle and flocks of sheep, were seized and redistributed. But livestock requires expertise, infrastructure, and most importantly, time to mature. Revolutionary fervor could not accelerate the natural cycles of animal husbandry. The new landowners, often urban revolutionaries with little agricultural experience, struggled to maintain the complex systems that had sustained French livestock for centuries. Breeding programs collapsed. Pastures were neglected. The delicate balance between grazing land and animal populations crumbled under inexperienced management. War compounded these domestic challenges exponentially. The revolutionary armies required enormous quantities of meat to sustain their campaigns across Europe. Military requisitions stripped the countryside of cattle, pigs, and sheep with ruthless efficiency. Farmers who had managed to preserve their herds found themselves forced to surrender their animals to feed the revolutionary cause. The economic disruption proved equally devastating to meat production. traditional trade routes that had connected French regions for centuries were severed by political upheaval. Cattle drivers who had moved herds from Normandy to Paris found their paths blocked by suspicious local authorities. Regional markets that had operated for generations simply ceased to function. Currency instability made livestock trading nearly impossible. Farmers hesitated to sell their animals for increasingly worthless assignats. Buyers struggled to negotiate prices when the value of money changed daily. The entire commercial infrastructure that had sustained French meat production collapsed under the weight of revolutionary chaos. Urban populations felt these shortages most acutely. Paris, once supplied by a vast network of rural producers, found its markets increasingly empty. The famous Les Halles market, traditionally overflowing with fresh meat, displayed only bare hooks and empty stalls. Butchers who had operated for generations were forced to close their shops. The few animals that reached urban markets commanded astronomical prices. A single chicken might cost more than a worker's weekly wage. Beef became so expensive that even the middle class could afford only the cheapest cuts. Pork, traditionally the meat of common people, disappeared from most tables entirely. Desperate urban dwellers turned to increasingly creative protein sources. Cats and dogs, once beloved pets, found themselves eyeing their owners' dinner plates with growing suspicion. Rats, pigeons, and even sparrows became legitimate game for hungry city residents. The Parisian police recorded numerous incidents of citizens hunting urban wildlife in parks and gardens. Rural communities faced different but equally severe challenges. While they might have access to wild game, traditional hunting rights had been reserved for the nobility. The revolution technically opened forests to common hunting, but centuries of legal prohibition had left most peasants without the skills, equipment, or knowledge necessary for successful hunting. The shortage of meat created a thriving black market throughout France. Smugglers moved livestock across regional boundaries under cover of darkness. Corrupt officials accepted bribes to overlook illegal slaughter operations. Underground butchers operated in cellars and abandoned buildings, processing stolen animals for desperate customers. Religious dietary restrictions added another layer of complexity to the meat shortage. Traditional Catholic fasting days, which had previously provided structure to meat consumption, were officially abolished by the revolutionary government. However, many citizens continued to observe these practices privately, creating confusion about when and how to consume their precious protein reserves. The government attempted various solutions to address the meat crisis. Price controls were imposed on butchers, but these measures only drove meat further underground. Rationing systems were established, but enforcement proved impossible without adequate administrative infrastructure. Public slaughterhouses were proposed, but construction required resources that simply didn't exist. Revolutionary authorities promoted alternative protein sources with limited success. Fish consumption was encouraged, but France's freshwater systems had been disrupted by industrial activities. Dairy products were suggested as meat substitutes, but milk production had declined along with cattle herds. Eggs became so valuable that chickens were often more prized for their laying capacity than their meat. The psychological impact of meat shortages extended far beyond simple hunger. Meat had represented prosperity, celebration, and social status for centuries. Its absence from French tables symbolized the broader collapse of traditional society. Families who had enjoyed Sunday roasts for generations found themselves confronting a fundamentally altered relationship with food. Children born during the Revolutionary period grew up with no memory of abundant meat. Their development was shaped by protein deficiency, creating a generation that would carry the physical and psychological scars of these shortages throughout their lives. Medical records from the period document widespread stunting and developmental delays directly attributable to inadequate nutrition. The meat shortage also transformed French cooking traditions permanently. Recipes that had relied on abundant animal protein were adapted to use minimal quantities of meat as flavoring rather than substance. Techniques for extending small amounts of meat through creative preparation became essential survival skills that would influence French cuisine for decades. As we drift deeper into this examination of revolutionary hunger, consider how the absence of something as fundamental as meat could reshape an entire society's relationship with sustenance and survival. While bread disappeared from tables across France, one liquid remained surprisingly abundant throughout the Revolution: wine. But even this staple of French life underwent dramatic transformations as social upheaval reshaped drinking culture from the ground up. Before the Revolution, wine consumption followed strict social hierarchies. The nobility sipped fine vintages from their private cellars, while peasants made do with thin, acidic piquette, essentially grape juice, mixed with water, and pressed from already used grape skins. This watered-down beverage contained barely any alcohol and tasted more like vinegar than wine. The wealthy bourgeoisie occupied the middle ground, purchasing decent wines from established vineyards, but never accessing the truly exceptional bottles reserved for aristocratic tables. These social distinctions around wine reflected broader class divisions that would soon explode into revolutionary fervor. When revolution erupted in 1789, wine production initially continued much as before. Vineyards still needed tending, grapes still required harvesting, and the French population still demanded their daily wine ration. However, the social meaning of wine consumption began shifting dramatically as revolutionary ideals took hold. Revolutionary leaders promoted wine as a democratic beverage, something that could unite all French citizens regardless of social background. They argued that wine represented the authentic spirit of France, unlike imported luxuries that symbolized aristocratic excess. This ideological transformation elevated wine from mere sustenance to patriotic duty. The reality proved more complicated than revolutionary rhetoric suggested. Quality wine remained expensive and difficult to obtain, especially as economic disruption spread throughout the country. Many vineyard owners fled France or faced execution, leaving their properties abandoned or managed by inexperienced overseers. Revolutionary authorities attempted to redistribute wine stocks from confiscated noble estates, but these efforts often resulted in chaos rather than equitable distribution. Valuable wine cellars were looted, rare vintages were consumed carelessly, and centuries of accumulated wine knowledge disappeared along with the aristocrats who possessed it. Urban populations faced particular challenges accessing wine during the Revolution. Traditional distribution networks collapsed as political upheaval disrupted commerce between rural producers and city consumers. Wine merchants, like other traders, struggled to maintain reliable supply chains amid constant political uncertainty. The revolutionary government implemented various schemes to ensure wine availability for urban workers. They established price controls, requisitioned wine from rural areas, and even attempted to create state-run distribution systems. These interventions often backfired, creating shortages and encouraging black market activity. Rural wine producers found themselves caught between competing demands from revolutionary authorities and practical necessities of wine production. Local officials demanded wine for urban distribution, while producers needed to maintain enough stock for their own communities and future production cycles. The quality of available wine deteriorated significantly during the revolutionary period. Inexperienced producers replaced skilled vintners. Proper aging became impossible amid political instability, and storage conditions suffered as traditional wine cellars were abandoned or repurposed for other uses. Revolutionary festivals and celebrations consumed enormous quantities of wine, often of poor quality, hastily produced for mass consumption. These events prioritized quantity over quality, reflecting broader revolutionary values that emphasized equality and accessibility over traditional markers of refinement. Wine adulteration became increasingly common as demand exceeded supply of genuine wine. Unscrupulous merchants diluted wine with water, added artificial coloring, and mixed in various substances to increase volume and profits. Consumers had little recourse against these practices amid the general breakdown of commercial regulation. The revolutionary calendar created new drinking occasions while eliminating traditional religious festivals associated with wine consumption. Revolutionary holidays required appropriate libations, leading to organized drinking events that differed dramatically from pre-revolutionary wine culture. Women's relationship with wine also evolved during the Revolution. Traditional restrictions on female drinking loosened as revolutionary ideals promoted gender equality. Women participated more openly in public drinking, though this development generated significant controversy and backlash from conservative elements. Regional variations in wine availability created new forms of inequality during the Revolution. Wine-producing regions maintained better access to quality beverages, while areas dependent on wine imports faced severe shortages. These disparities sometimes generated political tensions between different regions. The revolutionary government's attempts to regulate wine production and distribution revealed fundamental tensions between ideological goals and practical realities. Officials wanted to ensure equitable access to wine while maintaining production incentives, but these objectives often conflicted with each other. Wine taverns became important political spaces during the Revolution. These establishments served as informal meeting places where revolutionary ideas circulated alongside wine. Tavern keepers often played crucial roles in local political networks, making their establishments focal points for revolutionary activity. The economic disruption of revolution affected wine production in lasting ways. Many vineyards were abandoned or poorly maintained, leading to reduced harvests and declining quality that persisted for years after political stability returned. The loss of traditional winemaking knowledge proved particularly difficult to recover. Revolutionary authorities struggled to balance wine consumption with military needs. Soldiers required wine rations, but diverting wine to military use reduced civilian availability. This tension became particularly acute during periods of military mobilization, when wine demands from multiple sources exceeded available supplies. The revolution's impact on wine extended beyond immediate consumption to long-term changes in French drinking culture. Traditional wine rituals associated with religious observances disappeared, replaced by secular celebrations that emphasized collective rather than individual consumption. By the Revolution's end, wine remained central to French culture, but in fundamentally altered forms. The elaborate wine ceremonies of the old regime had vanished, replaced by more egalitarian drinking practices that reflected revolutionary values while accommodating practical constraints imposed by years of political and economic upheaval. As we'll explore next, the revolution's impact on dining extended far beyond what people drank to fundamentally reshape how French society approached the very concept of sharing meals together. While bread formed the foundation of the French diet, fruits and vegetables told an equally tragic story during the Revolutionary period. The produce that should have provided essential nutrients and variety became increasingly scarce, expensive, and of poor quality as the crisis deepened. Before the Revolution, France's agricultural system had already struggled with fruit and vegetable production. Unlike grain, which received significant attention from landowners and government officials, produce cultivation was often relegated to small kitchen gardens and marginal lands. The feudal system meant that peasants had limited access to the best growing areas, which were reserved for more profitable crops or grazing land for livestock. The climate disasters of the 1780s devastated fruit trees and vegetable crops just as severely as they affected grain production. The harsh winter of 1788-1789 killed fruit trees across northern France, eliminating sources of apples, pears, and stone fruits that families had relied upon for both fresh consumption and preservation. Vegetable gardens froze solid, destroying root vegetables that should have been stored for winter consumption. As the revolution progressed, the breakdown of traditional agricultural systems created new challenges for produce cultivation. Many of the skilled gardeners who had maintained estate gardens fled the country or were displaced by political upheaval. The knowledge of specialized growing techniques, pruning methods, and preservation practices began to disappear from many regions. The revolutionary government's focus on grain production meant that fruits and vegetables received little attention in agricultural planning. Price controls that were applied to bread and other staples often ignored produce, leading to wild price fluctuations that made fresh fruits and vegetables luxury items for most urban residents. A single apple might cost as much as a day's wages for a working-class family. Urban gardens that had previously supplied cities with fresh produce were often abandoned or repurposed during the Revolution. In Paris, many private gardens were converted to meeting spaces or military uses. The disruption of traditional market systems meant that even when produce was available in rural areas, it often couldn't reach urban consumers due to transportation difficulties and political instability. The types of fruits and vegetables available during this period were severely limited compared to what we might expect today. Potatoes, though gradually gaining acceptance, were still viewed with suspicion by many French people. Root vegetables like turnips and parsnips became increasingly important as they could be stored through winter. But even these were often of poor quality due to inadequate growing conditions. Leafy greens, which spoil quickly and require careful cultivation, became particularly scarce. Cabbage, when available, was often the only green vegetable many families could access for months at a time. The lack of fresh vegetables led to widespread nutritional deficiencies, particularly vitamin deficiencies that caused various health problems among the population. Fruit preservation techniques, while known, required resources that many families simply didn't have. Sugar for making preserves was expensive and often unavailable. Salt for certain preservation methods was also costly and sometimes rationed. Without proper preservation, any fruit that did become available had to be consumed immediately or would spoil, creating feast or famine cycles. The Revolutionary Wars further complicated produce availability. Military campaigns required provisions, and armies often requisitioned whatever fruits and vegetables were available in the areas they passed through. Farmers who might have grown diverse crops for local markets instead focused on whatever would be most likely to survive requisition or provide the best return in unstable economic conditions. Regional variations in produce availability became more pronounced during the Revolution. Areas near the Mediterranean continued to have access to citrus fruits and certain vegetables, while northern regions struggled with even basic root vegetables. However, the breakdown of trade networks meant that regional surpluses couldn't easily reach areas of scarcity. Wild foods became increasingly important as cultivated fruits and vegetables became scarce. People foraged for berries, nuts, and edible plants in forests and fields. However, this traditional knowledge was not evenly distributed, and many urban residents lacked the skills to safely identify and prepare wild foods. Competition for these resources also increased as more people turned to foraging. The quality of available produce suffered dramatically during this period. Without proper fertilization, pest control, or cultivation techniques, fruits and vegetables that did reach markets were often small, tough, or partially spoiled. Consumers had little choice but to accept whatever was available, regardless of quality. Seasonal eating, already a necessity in pre-industrial France, became even more restrictive during the Revolution. The brief periods when fresh fruits were available became precious moments of nutritional relief. Families would often gorge themselves on whatever seasonal produce they could obtain, knowing that months of scarcity lay ahead. The psychological impact of produce scarcity cannot be understated. Fresh fruits and vegetables represented not just nutrition, but also pleasure and variety in an otherwise monotonous diet. Their absence contributed to the general sense of deprivation and hardship that characterized daily life during the Revolution. Children suffered particularly from the lack of fruits and vegetables. Growing bodies required diverse nutrients that were simply unavailable to most families. The absence of vitamin C led to scurvy-like symptoms, while the lack of other essential nutrients affected growth and development across an entire generation. Some revolutionary leaders recognized the importance of produce cultivation, but their efforts were often hampered by more pressing concerns. A Attempts to promote kitchen gardens and fruit tree planting were overshadowed by the immediate need to address grain shortages and political instability. The black market for fruits and vegetables operated alongside the grain black market, but produce was even more difficult to transport and hide than grain. Fresh items spoiled quickly, making illegal trade risky and expensive. Only the wealthy could afford to participate in these underground markets for luxury items like fresh fruit. As we'll explore in our next segment, the scarcity of fruits and vegetables was closely connected to the broader collapse of France's food distribution systems, creating a cascade of nutritional problems that would affect the population for years to come. The challenges of food preservation during the French Revolution extended far beyond simple spoilage. Without modern refrigeration or chemical preservatives, French households relied on centuries-old techniques that were both labor-intensive and unreliable. Salt, the primary preservative, had become prohibitively expensive due to the Gabelle tax, forcing families to experiment with increasingly desperate alternatives. Traditional preservation methods required specific conditions that were often impossible to maintain during wartime. Root cellars needed consistent cool temperatures, but many urban dwellings lacked proper storage spaces. Smoking meat required steady supplies of wood, which had become scarce as forests were cleared for fuel. The delicate process of fermentation, used for preserving vegetables and dairy products, could be ruined by temperature fluctuations or contamination. The timing of the revolution proved particularly catastrophic for food preservation. The political upheaval coincided with several harsh winters, making it nearly impossible to maintain the cold storage necessary for preserving meat and dairy. Many families watched helplessly as their carefully preserved winter stores spoiled due to inadequate storage conditions or sudden temperature changes. Urban populations faced unique preservation challenges that rural communities could sometimes avoid. City dwellers had limited access to traditional preservation materials like clean straw for packing, fresh herbs for flavoring preserved foods, or even basic containers like wooden barrels. The crowded conditions of urban housing also made it difficult to maintain the cleanliness necessary for successful food preservation. The breakdown of trade networks severely impacted the availability of preservation supplies. Spices that had been used for centuries to preserve meat and mask the taste of slightly spoiled food became luxury items. Bay leaves, thyme, and other herbs that helped prevent spoilage were no longer accessible to common households. Even basic materials like vinegar, essential for pickling vegetables, became scarce commodities. Women who traditionally managed household food preservation found their expertise challenged by these new limitations. Recipes that had been passed down through generations became impossible to execute without proper ingredients or equipment. The psychological stress of watching carefully preserved food spoil due to circumstances beyond their control added another layer of suffering to already desperate families. The lack of proper preservation led to dangerous food safety practices. Families began consuming meat that would normally be considered spoiled, leading to increased rates of food poisoning and digestive illnesses. The distinction between slightly aged and dangerously spoiled food became blurred when hunger was the primary concern. People developed techniques for masking the taste and smell of questionable food, using whatever herbs or seasonings they could find. Dairy preservation presented particular challenges during this period. Without consistent access to salt for cheese making or proper cooling for milk storage, many families lost access to these important protein sources. The traditional French cheese-making regions saw their production severely disrupted, not only affecting local consumption, but also eliminating a valuable trade commodity. The preservation of bread, always challenging due to its tendency to mold quickly, became even more difficult during the Revolution. Families tried various methods to extend the life of their precious bread rations, from storing it in cloth wrappings to attempting to dry it into hard biscuits. However, without proper storage facilities, even these efforts often failed, leading to the consumption of moldy or stale bread that provided little nutritional value. Seasonal preservation patterns, which had governed French food culture for centuries, completely collapsed during the Revolutionary period. The traditional autumn preservation activities, when families would prepare for winter by smoking meats, pickling vegetables, and making preserves, became impossible without adequate resources. This disruption created a cascade effect that impacted nutrition throughout the following seasons. The psychological impact of failed food preservation cannot be understated. Families who had successfully preserved food for generations suddenly found themselves unable to maintain their stores. The sight of carefully prepared preserved foods spoiling represented not just a loss of nutrition, but a failure of traditional knowledge and family responsibility. This added emotional stress to an already overwhelming situation. Innovation born from desperation led to some creative, but often unsuccessful preservation attempts. Families tried using ash from fireplaces as a preservative, experimented with tree bark for smoking meat, and attempted to create makeshift cold storage using whatever materials they could find. While some of these experiments occasionally worked, most resulted in further food loss and disappointment. The communal aspects of food preservation also suffered during the Revolution. Traditionally, neighborhoods would work together for large preservation projects, sharing resources and knowledge. The social upheaval and suspicion that characterized the Revolutionary period made such cooperation difficult or impossible. Families became isolated in their preservation efforts, losing the collective wisdom that had made these techniques successful. Professional food preservers, such as those who specialized in curing meats or making preserves, found their businesses destroyed by the economic chaos. The loss of these skilled craftspeople meant that even when materials became available, the knowledge of proper preservation techniques was often lacking. This created a vicious cycle where both resources and expertise were simultaneously unavailable. The impact of failed food preservation extended beyond immediate hunger. Malnutrition caused by consuming spoiled or inadequately preserved food weakened immune systems, making populations more susceptible to disease. The connection between proper food preservation and public health became tragically apparent as illness rates soared in communities where preservation techniques had failed. As we move forward in our exploration of revolutionary food challenges, the failure of traditional preservation methods represents a fundamental breakdown in the relationship between French society and its food systems. These preservation challenges would continue to plague the population long after the immediate political crisis had passed, fundamentally altering French food culture and household management practices for generations to come. The relationship between food and disease during the French Revolution was a deadly dance that claimed countless lives. Without modern understanding of bacteria, viruses, or proper sanitation, the French population faced a constant battle against foodborne illnesses that weakened their bodies and shortened their lives dramatically. Water contamination represented perhaps the greatest threat to public health. The Seine River, which flowed through Paris, served simultaneously as a source of drinking water, a repository for human waste, and a dumping ground for industrial refuse. Tanneries, dye works, and slaughterhouses discharged their toxic byproducts directly into the waterways that supplied the city's wells and fountains. Citizens would draw water from wells that had been contaminated by nearby cesspits, creating a perfect breeding ground for cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever. The wealthy might have access to spring water or could afford to have water transported from cleaner sources. But the poor had no choice but to drink from whatever source was available, regardless of its questionable quality. Food storage presented another monumental challenge in an era without refrigeration. Meat would begin to spoil within hours of slaughter, especially during the warmer months. Merchants developed various techniques to mask the smell and appearance of rotting meat, including the liberal use of spices, salt, and even more dangerous substances like lead-based compounds to restore color to spoiled flesh. The practice of selling rancid meat was so common that customers developed their own methods of detection. They would smell, prod, and carefully examine their purchases. But even experienced buyers could be fooled by clever merchants who had perfected the art of disguising spoiled goods. The consumption of contaminated meat led to severe gastrointestinal distress, food poisoning, and in many cases, death. Grain storage facilities were breeding grounds for rodents, insects, and mold. Rats and mice would contaminate flour supplies with their droppings and urine, while weevils and other insects would infest stored wheat and barley. The presence of ergot, a fungus that grew on rye, could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and a condition known as St. Anthony's fire, which resulted in severe burning sensations and sometimes gangrene. Milk and dairy products posed their own unique dangers. Without pasteurization, milk could harbor tuberculosis, brucellosis, and numerous other bacterial infections. Dairy vendors would often water down their milk to increase profits, but the water they used was frequently contaminated with sewage or industrial waste, making the product even more dangerous than pure milk would have been. The production of cheese and butter occurred in unsanitary conditions, with workers handling products with unwashed hands and using contaminated utensils. Storage areas were often damp and poorly ventilated, encouraging the growth of harmful bacteria and mold. What people thought was aged cheese might actually be cheese that had been contaminated with dangerous microorganisms. Street vendors, who provided much of the food consumed by the urban poor, operated under the most unsanitary conditions imaginable. They would prepare food in the open air, exposed to dust, insects, and animal waste. Their cooking utensils were rarely cleaned properly, and they had no means of keeping food at safe temperatures. Raw ingredients were often stored in the same containers as cooked food, leading to cross-contamination. The preparation of popular street foods like meat pies, sausages, and prepared soups occurred in conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors. Vendors would use whatever meat was available, including animals that had died from disease, and would combine it with questionable vegetables and contaminated water to create meals that were as likely to cause illness as they were to satisfy hunger. Wine and beer, while often safer than water due to their alcohol content, presented their own health risks. Unscrupulous merchants would adulterate these beverages with dangerous substances to increase their potency or improve their appearance. Lead was commonly used to sweeten wine, resulting in chronic lead poisoning among regular consumers. Other additives included copper sulfate, alum, and various plant extracts that could cause severe illness. The brewing and winemaking processes themselves were often unsanitary. Fermentation vessels were rarely cleaned properly, and the storage of alcoholic beverages in lead-lined containers added another layer of toxicity. Even when these drinks were relatively pure, the high alcohol content and poor nutrition of the general population meant that alcoholism was rampant, further weakening people's immune systems. Seasonal variations in food availability meant that preservation techniques were crucial for survival. But these methods often introduced additional health risks. Salting, smoking, and pickling could preserve food for extended periods, but they also created conditions favorable to certain types of bacteria and parasites. Improperly cured meats could harbor botulism, while pickled vegetables might contain harmful levels of salt and other preservatives. The lack of understanding about nutrition meant that even when food was available, people's diets were often severely imbalanced. Scurvy was common among those who couldn't afford fresh fruits and vegetables, while rickets affected children who lacked access to vitamin D and calcium. These nutritional deficiencies weakened the immune system, making people more susceptible to infectious diseases. Medical knowledge of the time attributed many illnesses to bad air or imbalanced humors rather than contaminated food and water. This misunderstanding meant that effective preventive measures were rarely implemented. People might avoid certain foods based on superstition or tradition, but they lacked the scientific knowledge necessary to make informed decisions about food safety. The cumulative effect of these food safety issues was a population that lived in constant fear of illness and death. Families would lose multiple members to foodborne diseases, and entire neighborhoods could be devastated by outbreaks of cholera or dysentery. The weakened state of the population made them more susceptible to other diseases and reduced their ability to work and contribute to society. As we drift toward sleep, imagine the daily courage required to simply eat a meal during this tumultuous period. Every bite was a gamble, every sip of water a risk. Yet people persevered through these dangerous times. Their resilience, a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure even the most challenging circumstances. The stark divide between social classes during the French Revolution wasn't just about political power or economic status. It was literally a matter of life and death, measured in the quality and quantity of food on each table. While the aristocracy dined on elaborate multi-course meals, the common people scraped together whatever scraps they could find, often going days without proper nourishment. In the grand chateaux of Versailles and the elegant hotels particuliers of Paris, the nobility maintained their extravagant dining traditions, even as the country crumbled around them. A typical aristocratic dinner might feature dozens of dishes, each prepared by skilled chefs who had trained for years in the art of French cuisine. Roasted peacocks stuffed with exotic spices, delicate pastries filled with imported fruits, and wines from the finest vineyards flowed freely at these gatherings. The contrast was almost obscene. While Marie Antoinette allegedly suggested that the breadless masses should eat cake, the reality was far more complex and tragic. The Queen's supposed comment, whether real or fabricated, became a symbol of the aristocracy's complete disconnect from the suffering of ordinary French citizens. The nobility lived in a bubble of culinary excess, seemingly unaware that their subjects were literally starving in the streets below. For the bourgeoisie, the emerging middle class of merchants, lawyers, and professionals, food represented both aspiration and anxiety. They had enough resources to avoid the worst hunger, but they also understood how precarious their position truly was. A successful merchant might afford meat once or twice a week, along with decent bread and perhaps some butter or cheese. However, they lived in constant fear of economic collapse that could plunge them into the same desperate circumstances as the urban poor. The bourgeoisie often attempted to emulate aristocratic dining customs, hosting dinner parties with multiple courses and imported delicacies. Yet these gatherings were modest affairs compared to noble feasts. A bourgeois family might serve a soup course, followed by a meat dish with vegetables, and perhaps a simple dessert. Wine was present, but not abundant, and the portions were carefully calculated to avoid waste while maintaining social appearances. In the countryside, peasant families faced an entirely different reality. Their diet consisted primarily of dark bread, when available, supplemented by whatever vegetables they could grow in their small plots. Meat was an extraordinary luxury, reserved for special occasions or when an animal died naturally. Most peasants subsisted on a monotonous diet of bread, thin soup made from scraps, and occasionally some cheese or eggs when their animals produced enough surplus. The seasonal nature of peasant food created cycles of relative abundance and severe scarcity. Summer months brought fresh vegetables and fruits, providing essential nutrients that had been absent during the harsh winter months. However, these periods of plenty were brief and followed by long stretches of deprivation. Peasant families spent their summers desperately trying to preserve enough food to survive the coming winter, often failing despite their best efforts. Urban workers, particularly in Paris, faced unique challenges that differed from both rural peasants and the middle classes. Cramped living conditions made food storage nearly impossible, forcing workers to purchase their meals daily from street vendors or cheap taverns. These establishments served questionable food at inflated prices, taking advantage of workers who had no alternatives. A typical worker's meal might consist of watery soup, stale bread, and perhaps some salted meat of dubious origin. The apprentice system that had once provided young workers with regular meals began breaking down during the Revolutionary period. Master craftsmen, struggling with their own economic difficulties, could no longer afford to feed their apprentices properly. Young men who had expected to receive training and sustenance found themselves competing for scraps with the general population, adding to the overall desperation in urban areas. Women bore a disproportionate burden in managing household food supplies across all social classes. Aristocratic women supervised elaborate kitchen staffs and planned elaborate menus, while bourgeois wives carefully managed household budgets to maximize nutritional value. Peasant and working-class women performed miracles of resourcefulness, transforming scraps into meals and stretching meager supplies to feed entire families. The psychological impact of food inequality extended far beyond physical hunger. Social gatherings centered around food became painful reminders of class divisions. A wealthy merchant hosting a dinner party might feel embarrassed by the simplicity of his offerings compared to aristocratic standards, while his servants went home to empty cupboards. These daily humiliations fueled resentment that would eventually explode into revolutionary violence. Children suffered most acutely from these inequalities. Noble children grew up expecting abundance, developing refined palates and sophisticated dining habits that would serve them well in high society. Middle class children learned to appreciate food without taking it for granted, understanding that their comfort depended on their parents' continued success. Poor children, however, experienced chronic malnutrition that stunted their growth and limited their life prospects. The revolutionary government attempted to address these inequalities through various measures, including price controls and food distribution programs. However, these efforts often backfired, creating black markets and encouraging hoarding among those who could afford to stockpile supplies. The maximum, a law setting price ceilings on essential goods, made bread more affordable in theory, but often resulted in empty bakeries, as producers found the regulated prices unprofitable. Religious institutions had traditionally played a role in feeding the poor, but the revolution's anti-clerical policies disrupted these charitable networks. Monasteries and convents that had operated soup kitchens were dissolved, while church property was seized and sold. This left a significant gap in the social safety net just when it was needed most, forcing desperate families to rely on inadequate government programs or private charity. The irony of revolutionary ideals became apparent in the realm of food distribution. While the revolution promised equality and fraternity, the practical realities of feeding a nation meant that inequalities persisted and sometimes worsened. Those with political connections or revolutionary credentials often received better rations, while suspected counter-revolutionaries found themselves at the back of bread lines, if they were served at all. As we drift deeper into this exploration of revolutionary France, let the weight of these inequalities settle into your consciousness. The empty stomachs, the desperate searches for sustenance, the cruel contrasts between abundance and want. All of these painted the backdrop against which one of history's most dramatic transformations unfolded. The revolution may have promised liberty, equality, and fraternity, but for most French citizens, the most pressing concern remained devastatingly simple: finding enough food to survive another day. The revolutionary government's attempts to control food distribution created a bureaucratic maze that would make modern red tape look simple. The Committee of Public Safety, already overwhelmed with executing enemies of the state, now found itself trying to manage the feeding of an entire nation. Their approach was characteristically revolutionary, ambitious, idealistic, and utterly impractical. The maximum, that price control system we discussed earlier, was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The government established the Commission of Subsistence, a body tasked with coordinating food supplies across France. This commission had the monumental task of tracking grain stores, organizing transport, and ensuring equitable distribution. In theory, it was a brilliant, centralized system. In practice, it was chaos wrapped in paperwork. Local administrators received contradictory orders from Paris. One week, they were told to requisition all grain above a certain amount from farmers. The next week, they were instructed to leave enough for the farmers to survive. Meanwhile, the farmers themselves were hiding their grain, selling it on black markets, or simply refusing to grow more than they needed for their own families. Why work harder when the government would simply take the surplus? The requisition system became increasingly aggressive as the revolution progressed. Armed bands of officials would descend on rural areas, demanding to search every barn, every cellar, every hiding place where grain might be stored. These searches were thorough and often violent. Farmers who resisted faced imprisonment or worse. The irony was palpable. A revolution that began with cries of liberty had created a system where citizens lived in fear of their own government's food inspectors. Transportation became another nightmare for the revolutionary bureaucrats. France's road system, already poor, deteriorated further during the revolution. Bridges were destroyed in various uprisings. Horses and carts were requisitioned for military use. The result was that even when grain was available in one region, getting it to hungry areas became nearly impossible. Wagons loaded with flour would sit rotting at broken bridges, while people starved just miles away. The government's solution was to create more bureaucracy. They established transport committees, bridge repair committees, and committees to oversee the committees. Each level of administration required reports, permissions, and approvals. A simple shipment of grain from Normandy to Paris might require dozens of signatures and stamps. By the time all the paperwork was complete, the grain had often spoiled or been stolen. Corruption flourished in this system like mold in damp bread. Officials who controlled food distribution suddenly found themselves with enormous power. A well-placed bribe could ensure your family received their full ration of bread. A word to the right person could get you access to meat or sugar. The revolutionary ideals of equality crumbled when faced with hungry children and empty cupboards. The black market became so extensive that it operated almost openly. In Paris, certain streets were known as places where you could buy forbidden goods at inflated prices. A pound of butter that officially cost 5 sous might sell for 50 on the black market. Coffee, chocolate, and white bread became luxury items available only to those with connections or coins. The government's response was predictably harsh. They created special courts to try food crimes. Hoarding grain could result in death. Selling above the maximum price was punishable by imprisonment. Even buying on the black market became a criminal offense. The prisons filled with bakers, farmers, and ordinary citizens. whose only crime was trying to feed their families. Regional variations in policy made the situation even more confusing. What was legal in one district might be criminal in another. A farmer living near a departmental border might find that selling his grain across the line was suddenly an act of treason. These inconsistencies created opportunities for smuggling and profiteering, further undermining the government's efforts. The assignats, those revolutionary paper bills backed by confiscated church lands, complicated food transactions even further. As their value fluctuated wildly, merchants became reluctant to accept them. A baker might agree to sell bread for assignats in the morning, only to find that by afternoon, the currency had lost half its value. This uncertainty made merchants even more likely to demand hard currency or resort to barter. International trade, crucial for feeding France's population, became nearly impossible under these conditions. Foreign merchants were unwilling to accept assignats, and the government lacked the gold and silver needed for international purchases. France, once a major grain importer, found itself increasingly isolated from global food markets. The government's attempts to control food production extended beyond simple requisitions. They tried to dictate what crops farmers should plant, when they should plant them, and how much land should be devoted to each crop. Agricultural committees were established to monitor farming practices. This micromanagement ignored local conditions, soil quality, and weather patterns that farmers had understood for generations. Seasonal variations in food availability became more pronounced under government control. The natural rhythms of harvest and storage were disrupted by bureaucratic interference. Grain that should have been stored for winter consumption was often requisitioned immediately after harvest, leaving communities vulnerable to spring shortages. The psychological impact of these policies was perhaps as damaging as their practical effects. Citizens lived in constant uncertainty about their next meal. The simple act of buying bread became a source of anxiety and frustration. Long lines, empty shelves, and suspicious officials created an atmosphere of perpetual crisis that wore down the population's morale. Despite these massive efforts and the creation of an enormous bureaucracy, food shortages persisted throughout the revolutionary period. The government's policies often made problems worse rather than better. Their attempts to control prices led to shortages. Their requisitions discouraged production. Their complex regulations created opportunities for corruption and black market activity. As we drift toward sleep, consider the irony of revolutionary France's food policies. A government born from the people's hunger for both bread and freedom created a system that provided neither. The bureaucratic maze they constructed to solve the food crisis became part of the problem itself, a lesson in how good intentions and poor execution can create suffering on a massive scale. While Paris dominated the revolutionary narrative, the reality of food during this period varied dramatically across France's diverse regions. Each province faced unique challenges, maintained distinct culinary traditions, and experienced the revolution's impact differently on their dinner tables. In the fertile Loire Valley, known for its vineyards and orchards, the revolution initially brought hope for agricultural reform. The region's peasants had long worked the extensive estates of absent nobles, tending vines and fruit trees while surviving on simple fare. When the revolution began, they expected to finally benefit from the land they had cultivated for generations. The Loire's traditional peasant diet centered around river fish, particularly pike and carp, caught in the region's numerous waterways. These were prepared simply, often in stews with whatever vegetables could be grown in small kitchen gardens. Apples and pears from the orchards provided both fresh fruit and the basis for local ciders and perry alcoholic beverages that were safer to drink than water. However, the revolution's disruption of trade networks meant that Loire wine producers suddenly lost their aristocratic customers. Vineyards that had produced fine wines for noble tables found themselves with no market for their product. Many vignerons were forced to abandon their carefully tended vines and turn to subsistence farming, growing turnips and barley where once premium grapes had flourished. Moving south to Provence, the Mediterranean climate had always provided a different food culture entirely. Here, olive oil replaced butter, and the abundance of herbs, vegetables, and fruits created a cuisine that seemed almost exotic to northern French palates. Provençal peasants traditionally enjoyed tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants, vegetables that were still viewed with suspicion in Paris. The region's coastal location meant that fish and seafood formed a crucial part of the diet. Fishermen from Marseille and other ports brought in sardines, anchovies, and various Mediterranean fish that were preserved in salt or olive oil. These preserved fish became even more important during the Revolution, when fresh supplies became unreliable due to political upheaval and economic disruption. Provence's olive groves faced particular challenges during the revolutionary period. The complex process of olive cultivation and oil production required stability and investment that became increasingly difficult to maintain. Many olive presses, traditionally owned by local nobles or the church, were abandoned or destroyed during the more violent phases of the Revolution. In the mountainous regions of the Alps and Pyrenees, isolation had always shaped the local food culture. These communities had developed sophisticated methods of food preservation out of necessity, creating aged cheeses, dried meats, and preserved vegetables that could sustain them through harsh winters when trade routes were blocked by snow. The revolution's impact on these mountain communities was often delayed, but no less significant. The disruption of traditional salt trade routes meant that communities that had relied on salt for preserving meat and cheese suddenly found themselves without this essential commodity. Salt had been heavily taxed under the old regime, and while the revolution promised to eliminate these taxes, the chaos of the period often meant that salt simply became unavailable at any price. Alpine communities had traditionally produced distinctive cheeses like Gruyere and Comté, which required specific techniques passed down through generations. The revolution's attack on traditional guild systems disrupted these knowledge networks, and many cheese-making traditions were temporarily lost as master craftsmen fled or were killed during the period's violence. In Brittany, the Celtic influence on food culture created yet another distinct regional variation. The Breton diet heavily featured buckwheat, which grew well in the region's acidic soil and provided the basis for the famous galettes. These savory pancakes were often the primary source of calories for Breton peasants, served with whatever small amounts of meat, fish, or vegetables could be obtained. The coastal location of Brittany meant that seaweed was traditionally harvested and used both as fertilizer and as food. Various types of edible seaweed were dried and stored, providing essential minerals and nutrients during the winter months. This practice, largely unknown in other parts of France, helped Breton communities maintain better nutrition even during the worst food shortages of the revolutionary period. Brittany's strong Catholic traditions also meant that the revolution's attack on the church had profound effects on local food customs. Many traditional feast days and fasting periods were eliminated, disrupting seasonal eating patterns that had been maintained for centuries. The revolutionary calendar's attempt to replace Christian holidays with civic festivals often ignored the agricultural rhythms that had shaped Breton food culture. The northern regions of France, including Flanders and Artois, had developed a cuisine influenced by their Flemish neighbors. Here, beer rather than wine was the traditional beverage, and the diet featured more meat and dairy products than in the south. The flat, fertile plains of the north had always been France's primary grain-producing region, making these areas crucial to the nation's food supply. During the Revolution, these northern regions faced particular pressure to increase grain production to feed the urban populations. The revolutionary government's policies often ignored local food traditions, demanding that farmers abandon traditional crop rotations and livestock raising to focus solely on grain production. This short-sighted approach led to soil exhaustion and reduced overall agricultural productivity. The region's traditional brewing industry also suffered during the Revolution. Many breweries were owned by religious orders or nobles, and their closure or confiscation disrupted local beer production. Since beer was often safer to drink than water and provided essential calories and nutrients, its scarcity had serious health consequences for local populations. In the eastern regions of Alsace and Lorraine, German influence created food traditions that were distinctly different from the rest of France. luxurious sausages and rye bread formed the basis of the local diet. These regions had developed sophisticated food preservation techniques, including the production of smoked meats and fermented vegetables that could be stored for months. The revolution's nationalism often conflicted with these regions' cultural traditions. Foods that were seen as German were sometimes viewed with suspicion, and traditional recipes were modified to appear more French. This cultural pressure led to the temporary abandonment of some traditional preservation methods, ironically making these communities more vulnerable to food shortages. Each region's response to revolutionary food policies reflected these deep cultural and agricultural differences. While Paris might decree universal solutions to food problems, the reality on the ground was that each region had its own resources, traditions, and challenges that required different approaches to survival during this tumultuous period. As we reach the end of our journey through the culinary catastrophe that was the French Revolution, it's worth reflecting on how profoundly food shaped this pivotal moment in history. What began as bread riots in the streets of Paris evolved into a complete transformation of French society, politics, and culture. The empty stomachs of the Third Estate didn't just fuel their anger. They fundamentally altered the course of human civilization. The food crisis of the French Revolution wasn't merely a backdrop to political upheaval. It was the very engine that drove revolutionary change. When Marie Antoinette allegedly suggested that the people eat cake, she wasn't just displaying aristocratic ignorance. She was unknowingly articulating the vast chasm between the ruling class and the starving masses. That chasm would ultimately consume the monarchy itself, along with thousands of nobles who had lived in blissful ignorance of their subjects' suffering. Consider the remarkable transformation that occurred in French eating habits during this period. Before the Revolution, French cuisine was already developing its reputation for sophistication, but it was a sophistication reserved for the wealthy. The common people ate simple, repetitive meals based on whatever grains they could afford. During the Revolution, even these basic staples became luxuries. People who had never imagined eating anything other than bread suddenly found themselves experimenting with chestnuts, turnips, and whatever else they could forage or afford. The maximum, that well-intentioned but ultimately disastrous attempt at price controls, demonstrated how even revolutionary governments struggled to understand the complexities of food distribution. The Jacobins, for all their political acumen, discovered that you cannot simply legislate abundance into existence. Their attempts to control food prices created black markets, encouraged hoarding, and ultimately made the food situation worse for the very people they claimed to represent. The terror itself was intimately connected to food scarcity. Robespierre and his allies justified their increasingly extreme measures by pointing to the ongoing food crisis. Every execution, every purge, every radical policy was presented as necessary to protect the people from starvation. The guillotine became not just an instrument of political justice, but a tool for ensuring that bread would somehow, eventually, return to French tables. What's particularly fascinating is how the revolution changed not just what people ate, but how they thought about food itself. Before 1789, hunger was often viewed as a natural consequence of one's station in life. The poor were expected to be hungry. It was part of the divine order. The revolution shattered this assumption, establishing the radical idea that access to food was a fundamental human right, not a privilege to be earned or inherited. The sans-culottes, those urban revolutionaries who wore long pants instead of aristocratic knee breeches, made food access a central part of their political identity. They didn't just want political representation. They wanted guaranteed access to affordable bread. Their demands helped establish the principle that governments have a responsibility to ensure their citizens don't starve, a concept that would influence social policy for centuries to come. The revolution's impact on French agriculture was equally profound. The abolition of feudalism didn't just free peasants from legal obligations to their lords. It fundamentally altered how land was owned, worked, and the pressure was immense, and the learning curve was steep. Even the calendar reform reflected the revolution's obsession with food and agriculture. The new revolutionary calendar abandoned Christian feast days in favor of celebrations tied to the agricultural cycle. Instead of celebrating saints, the French were encouraged to honor turnips, chestnuts, and other humble foods that had sustained them through the crisis. It was a remarkable attempt to create a new relationship between people and their food supply. The long-term consequences of the revolution's food crisis extended far beyond France's borders. Other European nations watched in horror as food shortages brought down what had seemed like the most stable monarchy in Europe. The lesson was clear. Ignore your people's hunger at your own peril. This realization would influence government policies across the continent for generations. Perhaps most importantly, the French Revolution established food security as a legitimate political concern. Before 1789, rulers might provide charity during famines, but they didn't generally accept responsibility for ensuring their subjects had enough to eat. The revolution changed this calculus forever, making food policy a central concern of modern governance. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that the bread on your table, the variety in your diet, and the very expectation that food should be available and affordable all trace their origins, in part, to those hungry revolutionaries who stormed the Bastille over 2 centuries ago. Their empty stomachs helped create the modern world, one meal at a time. Sweet dreams, and may your sleep be filled with the gentle sounds of history's most boring, yet most essential revolutions.